Okay, it's up. Let's do this. Like I said, my name is Gretchen Fox, and I'm part of the FPCC Heritage team, and I'm going to be the coordinator for this new grant. My contact information is shared a few times later in this presentation, and it's also on our website. So please reach out to me anytime with any questions that you might have about this grant. We have about a 15-minute presentation, and then, like I said, about 45 minutes for questions. So the presentation provides an overview of the Cultural Practices Grant, including what the grant is, the types of activities that it supports, who can apply, the eligible costs, some application requirements and tips, the grant's timeline, and how to apply. The Cultural Practices Grant is a new grant that supports BC First Nations and First Nation-led organizations in planning, carrying out, and documenting community-based cultural practices and events that affirm and celebrate cultural identities, foster a sense of belonging within First Nations communities, and that celebrate the roles, relationships, and responsibilities within a community. Applicants to this grant can apply for between $10,000 and $25,000 for their projects. This grant is made possible through funding from the Ministry of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation, and it's part of a larger federal initiative focused on preventing gender-based violence and supporting survivors. We know that Indigenous women, children, and gender-diverse people are more likely to be impacted by this type of violence. And we also know that there is strength, pride, and resilience in cultural practices, roles, and relationships. And the Cultural Practices Grant was developed with this in mind. The objectives of this grant are to support revitalizing, recognizing, and strengthening cultural practices, to support and facilitate intergenerational knowledge transfer and learning, to support activities and practices that affirm identities, that foster belonging, and that celebrate roles and relationships within a community, and also to support cultural practices that promote collective safety and well-being within BC First Nations, and that support cultural practices as a way to prevent and heal from gender-based violence. Cultural activities supported by this grant could be cultural practices that have been continuously carried on over generations, and they could also be sleeping practices that a community wants to and is ready to reawaken. So some examples of events and activities that are eligible for funding through this grant include, but aren't limited to, celebrations that honor children, youth, and other people who hold important roles within their community, gatherings and events focused on modeling safe, healthy relationships and preparing children and youth for the future, seasonal and celestial activities and events, reawakening of cultural places and their traditions on the land, documenting oral histories, protocols, laws, and stories about cultural practices, and developing teaching tools around cultural practices for use by and for BC First Nations youth programs, communities, and First Nations schools. If you're interested in proposing an activity or an event that's not included on this list, please do reach out to us at CPG, as in Cultural Practices Grant, at fpcc.ca, and this is, I'll repeat that and it'll be later in the presentation too, so that we can discuss how your project might fit into the program's areas of focus. Something important that I wanted to bring up is that this grant is not intended to fund sacred, private, family, clan, or individual ceremonies. And FPCC understands that cultural practices are unique and diverse across BC First Nations and that they're often not meant to be shared. Therefore, the reporting on this grant doesn't require details or specifics about activities and cultural practices. Something else that's important to keep in mind is the role of community support. Support and leadership from elders and cultural advisors who hold recognized roles within the community is essential to ensuring projects are carried out in a safe, respectful, and proper way. And so with this in mind, applicants are asked to demonstrate that the people who are designated in their application as leading the project activities, that they hold existing community recognized roles within their community, and that those roles are in line with the kinds of activities proposed. So who can apply for this grant? Eligible applicants follow FPCC's mandate for eligible funding, and that includes recognized BC First Nation bands or tribal councils, not-for-profit societies registered in BC who are in good standing and governed by BC First Nations individuals. And this means that where at least 75% of directors are members of recognized BC First Nations. BC First Nations-led museums and cultural spaces, where at least 75% of directors are members of a recognized BC First Nation. Urban and off-reserve BC First Nations organizations, where at least 75% of directors are members of a recognized BC First Nation. And BC First Nation schools and adult education centers operating in BC on First Nations lands. Please note, though, that we are not able to fund K-12 classroom activities or post-secondary accredited courses or tuition. Societies and organizations that are not BC First Nations band governments may be asked to provide documentation confirming their legal name and a list of the organization's current board of directors and their governance structure. Additionally, societies may be asked to share their certificate of good standing, their certificate of registration, and a copy of their bylaws, constitution, and proof of insurance. On a case-by-case basis, FPCC will consider applications from organizations that are still in the process of achieving a not-for-profit or society status. So please, if this applies to you, please do reach out to us so that we can discuss this further. Eligible costs. Okay, project costs must be directly applied to and be essential to the project. Costs will be reviewed to determine if they're reasonable and that they've been accurately estimated. But eligible project costs for the Cultural Practices Grant can include honoraria, salaries and wages, costs associated with contractors and consultants if a project requires these kinds of special skills. These costs can't exceed 30% of the funding requested, and the funding recipient must show that they've made best efforts to hire an Indigenous contractor or to provide justification for why a non-Indigenous contractor was hired. And Indigenous contractors and consultants should be prioritized. We'll also require a written quote if a contractor cost is over $1,000. Equipment rentals and purchases, and this would include things like recording devices and computers to support project work, administrative costs, up to 15% of the funding requested, software needed to achieve the project's objectives, meeting space and event space rentals, materials and supplies, food and hospitality costs that are reasonable and necessary, and travel costs that are reasonable and necessary. Depending on your project, the costs, of course, will vary. So if you have any questions, please reach out to us. And there's more specific guidelines about eligible costs in the funding guide for the Cultural Practices Grant. And I have linked that in the chat, but I will also relink it as we go into the Q&A section shortly. There are other expenses too that could be eligible, and so you're encouraged to reach out to us if you have any expenses that don't fall into these categories that are necessary for your project. Projects funded through the Cultural Practices Grant must include a training or a mentorship component. This supports the grant objectives of revitalizing and strengthening cultural practices while also facilitating intergenerational knowledge transfer. Teachers and mentors must be recognized within the community as the appropriate people to train and mentor others in the types of activities that your project would involve. And likewise, the people who are receiving the training or mentorship must also have support of the community to receive this training. Next, we want to briefly mention a few things that will help you succeed in developing your project proposal. And these are also things that will help the independent peer review committee to evaluate your grant application, make it as strong as possible. Applications can't be reviewed until all necessary information is provided. And you'll note that if you go in to start an application on our grant portal, that many of the fields are required before the application can be submitted. Applications must include the following: a clear project description, a balanced project budget with detailed descriptions for each category, a thorough work plan with dates for key activities, a project timeline that fits within the grant funding term. So the grant funding term for this grant is January activities starting on or after January 6th, 2025, and wrapping up by March 16th, 2026. So it's about 15 months to get that project to completion. Letters demonstrating support from the First Nation or organization and from the community. So there are letters of support required if you are applying as a First Nation band, and slightly different types of letters of support that are required for organizations and societies. So that information is in the funding guide, along with a flow chart to help guide you along to see what kind of letters of support you will need, who they need to be from, and who is not eligible to write a letter of support. You'll need to include quotes from contractors if they are doing work that is over $1,000. And finally, applications must include proof of additional confirmed funding. So if you're proposing a project and requesting some funding from FPCC, but you also are requesting or have secured funding from another source, other source funding needs to be included and described in the application as well. So here is the timeline for the grant. The application deadline is October 22nd. Like I mentioned, projects can start on or after January 6th, 2025. There's a short interim report due in September of that year, and then projects completed and final reports are due March 16th, 2026. Applications are now open on FPCC's grant portal, which can be accessed at fpcc.citizen1.ca. You'll need to create an account to apply, and the portal will lead you through this quick and easy process. So this is a new grant portal. If you have had FPCC funding for a project, grant funding for a project before, you may be familiar with our old grant portal, and we're transitioning to a new one. So the Cultural Practices Grant applications, reporting, everything for this grant is going to be done on the new portal. So please do reach out if you have any questions about that. And if you need support preparing your application, please do reach out to us again at cpg@fpcc.ca. And please try to reach out 2 weeks before the deadline. And I know this is coming up very, very shortly. Just for future information as well, the Cultural Practices Grant is going to have 2 intakes. So we have this intake in the fall, and then we'll have another intake for the grant next spring. So around April, we'll have a second intake. This concludes, thank you. This concludes our presentation portion. So I'm going to switch the presentation off and we can open it up for questions. You can use the Q&A feature, and Lucas and Kim are going to help me keep up with the questions and answers. And I see that we do have a question.
We have already 2.
Okay, perfect. I will try my best. If I'm not able to answer your questions right now, I will jot them down and I will get back to you.
Okay. The first question is about the window for the application and asking why it's so short period for the application.
Yeah, that's a good question. It is a very short period for the question or for the application period for submission. We had a bit of a delay with transitioning over to the new portal system on our end. So the application grant opened a week after we had hoped it would, but due to where the holidays fall with holiday closures and the need to get the project started in January, we do have a shorter than ideal opening period, and we are here to help you to answer your questions and get your applications in on time. But I do recognize that it is a shorter than usual period for the grant opening.
Another question is about a template, if there is any template available for the application.
Interesting question. We don't have a printed out template in the funding guide. The funding guide does go through all of the sections of the application, and it gives tips for what should be included in those applications. I would suggest that you do, if you're interested in applying and you want to know what the application looks like, that you can go to the portal and register an account, which just means registering your email, and then you will be able to see what the blank application looks like, so that you can, if you want to work on it offline and then go and submit online, that will give you an idea of what the fields are going to be, what the questions are going to be asking for.
I just want to jump in because there are questions coming in the Q&A and the chat. So I just want to jump over to the Q&A for a sec.
Okay.
So the first question in the Q&A is, are there exceptions for hereditary chiefs and their WILPs to apply for an individual grant? Many have hundreds of members in a single WILP. Can this be looked at if it is not?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you for that question. That is a question that we have gotten before. And unfortunately, at this time, due to FPCC's mandate with who we can fund, we are not able to fund hereditary governance systems at this time, but it's something that we're looking into, and we do recognize that this is an issue that needs to be looked at further. And I know that's probably not the answer that you're looking for, but we are constrained right now by organizational and legislative mandates.
There is a group of questions related to the possibility to a nation or organization present more than one application, and if it's possible to see who is applying, if they are from the same community.
So only one application for this grant intake can be submitted by a community. So we really encourage collaboration within your community to work together and determine if there's any way that your project could be combined into a single project, because we are unfortunately only able to review one application per community. You could do an application this intake and an application the next intake, though, different one.
There's a question here in the Q&A. When will the decision notification be made if projects can start in January 2025?
We are hoping to early to mid-December, so before the holiday break is our goal. We have our peer review committee that will meet in mid-November, and then we need to do a little administrative work, and then we'll be reaching out to successful applicants as early as possible.
There is a couple of questions asking if it's possible a for-profit organization to present an application supported by the nation. And also there is another question asking about if a nonprofit organization can present an application.
Okay, so we cannot consider applications from for-profit organizations, but we can from nonprofit organizations as long as they are registered societies in BC, and as long as 75% of the board of directors are from recognized BC First Nations.
We do have another one in the Q&A section. Could you expand on what the training and mentorship component could look like? What are some examples?
Oh, that's a good one. Okay. So for training and mentorship, let me think about this. Well, one example might be if a community or an organization wanted to do a documentation or an oral history project to gather and document information about cultural practices, that might be an opportunity for young people to receive some training in how to do oral history, the protocols around asking permission to of elders and knowledge holders to share information, and other protocols around oral history work. And then they might be mentored by those with experience in the community to do that. Another example might be if there is an event or a celebration honoring like a first salmon or a first deer ceremony or something, there would be opportunities for young people to be mentored by knowledge holders in the community about what to do at that ceremony, the meaning of it, all of the different practices and protocols around that. So what's really important is that the people who are mentoring have those recognized roles in the community to teach younger folks or people who haven't had learners, I guess, usually younger folks, but not always, about those cultural practices.
Another question from the chat is about the deadline for application for the spring intake window.
Mm-hmm. We don't have an exact timeline for that yet. Our spring grant intakes usually are open until sometime in, I believe, in mid-April. Is that right, Lucas and Kim? Is that for the other grants that we have? They usually open in late March and close in late April, early May.
It's variable.
So, okay.
But yeah, I suppose so, yeah.
We're trying to, the idea is to line the second intake for the cultural practices grant up with our usual calendar. But we have this funding, and we really wanted to get the funding out to communities as soon as possible. So we're doing this fall intake in addition to the spring.
Sorry, I'm just trying to find out where we are in the questions.
There is another one here asking about the eligibility criteria for food and hospitality. Does this include harvesting?
Oh, that's it. That's a good question. Okay. Food and hospitality would it include the cost of harvesting for food that would be shared at an event? I'm thinking. I think so. I don't think I hadn't thought about that before, but I don't see why not.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah.
Another question here for projects involving, I think you might have grouped some of these together, Lucas, already, but for projects involving multiple nations, would each nation need to provide a ban council resolution or a chief and council letter of support?
Yes, I believe so. If the applicant is in that case, if it would be a tribal council, I guess, or an organization that is representing 8 different communities. That's one that I want to get back to you on, and I will look at that question more carefully rather than taking time to flip through. I have the funding guide here, but I don't want to take up our time. It might take me a bit, and I might have to ask somebody after this. So whoever asked that question, I can probably see in the chat. I will get back to you on that.
There's another question. Can this be a youth camp inclusive of sports with a language component and on the land?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Another
Yeah,
question
I would
is,
just.
go ahead.
I was just going to say, I would just make sure in the application that it's very clear with the cultural, language, obviously. Just be very clear about how cultural practices are part of your activity in your project. But yeah, for sure.
Can the same person apply for this grant for 2 different societies?
Yes, as long as the societies are the applicants. The person submitting the applications could be the same person, as long as the applicant and the project are the recipient of the grant would be separate organizations. Yes.
Okay. Is there a cap dollar amount for applications? Meaning, will there only be a certain amount of applications accepted? Example, 5 grants at $20,000 each.
Mm-hmm. The applicants have to request between $10,000 and $25,000 for their project, and we're estimating there'll be about 20 to 25 grants awarded this cycle.
Is there any funding available for a name-giving ceremony to recognize all the work they have done in and outside for their children and members?
Yes, naming ceremonies would absolutely be eligible under this grant.
I'm going to flip back over to the Q&A here. Maybe Gretchen, you spoke to this already, but for the second intake in April, when would applicants find out if they will receive funding?
I would estimate, again, we don't have scheduled dates right now, but I would estimate that they would find out in June. And that the grant period would again be sort of 16 months for the, to do the project. Same amount of time as this one.
And there's just one more in the Q&A that I'll address now.
Okay.
Can you use the whole grant for a single wage example? The example is a cultural assistant.
I just want to look really quickly. I think that might be capped. No, salaries and wages are not capped. They just have to be specific to the project. I don't actually know the answer to that. My inclination is to say that the application would be much stronger if project activities were funded through that. But if there was additional funding from another source to do a robust project, but funding was needed for a salary or a wage, and that it came through this, I think that would be possible. That's something maybe Kim, do you have an input on that?
Yeah, I think as long as you can show that the other project activities are being covered in kind or by other grant sources, then you can spread the activities out for the other funding that way, and then have this one cover the salaries, because we don't have a cap on it for this grant.
Mm-hmm.
Next question is, if we work as a representative of 8 different communities in one nation, would an application make all of our individual communities ineligible?
Okay, so if there's an organization that represents these communities and they apply, and then one of the communities applies separately, would that be ineligible? No, I don't think so, because say if there's an organization that represents 8 communities, they would be applying as that organization. And then as long as one of the communities, if they're doing their own application for a separate project, then I think that both would be eligible. It would be if the same organization is applying for 2 or more projects and the funding is coming to the same organization, or if a community is applying for 2 or more and the funding is coming to that same community, that's not eligible. But as long as there are different groups, then yes, that would be fine.
Is there a cap on the amount of funding available? We covered that. And will applications be adjudicated on a first come, first served basis, or on merit once all are received?
They will be adjudicated on merit once all of them are received. So the funding period closes October 22nd, and then the peer review committee will receive all of the applications, or will receive the applications for review in early to mid-November. So it's not on a rolling basis, but all together on merit. Yeah.
The next question is, we are an Aboriginal nonprofit organization and our treatment center is set to open in the new year. We would like to construct a traditional pit house and collaborate with the First Nation band on which our center will be located. The pit house will serve as a traditional gathering place for the clients attending the treatment center. Would building the pit house qualify for to apply for?
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's a good question. So this grant cannot fund infrastructure or construction, but it can fund events and activities around, say, the opening or the planning for, the celebration for, or events that happen around the center. We just can't fund the actual construction work. So if you had, for instance, an event that celebrated the opening of the center, or if the center wanted to put on some events that were revitalizing cultural practices or involve cultural practices, those could be eligible, but not the building costs or the construction costs themselves.
For this, we have another grant. It makes some advancement about the Heritage Infrastructure Program. You can access our website and get more information about.
We have another one. So asking about the funding cap. So I think this is about the amount that we can fund in total rather than the grant itself. I'm not really sure. What is the funding cap on this grant? That was the question.
Okay, the funding cap for this grant is around, I believe we have around 800,000 for this intake, and most of that is grant. There's a small percentage of that that's administrative, but the way that we have it set up, no, actually it's closer to 6 this time around and 8 next time. For some reason, I'd have to go back, but in order to fund, we had to look at a balance. We wanted to fund as many projects as we could, but we also wanted to make sure that the funding available was going to be enough to do a substantial project. And so we came up with that range of $10,000 to $25,000 for a project. And we also needed to consider how many projects that we could administrate over a given time period as well. And so that was given the amount of funding and then other constraints and wanting to fund as many projects as possible, between 10 and 25,000 is where we landed for about 20 to 25 projects this cycle.
The next one is, I'd like to know as well if a BCR is required, as I work for a nonprofit foundation that serves Stalo territory, not a specific band.
Okay, that's a really good question too. So the letters of support that are required for nonprofit societies include a letter of support from a neighboring community. And that support could be in the form of a BCR. It could be a letter of support from a chief or council member. BCR itself is not necessarily required, but yes, if you're a nonprofit proposing a project on First Nations lands that involve BC First Nations peoples and communities, then yes, we do require a letter of support from a nearby community, the closest community that you would, have a relationship with, presumably. And that there's a information in the funding guide.
So the next one is, does First Peoples Cultural Council fund registered nonprofit Indigenous organizations in British Columbia that provide Indigenous frontline land-based health recovery and wellness education training support services to urban Indigenous youth, adult, elders, and veterans?
Absolutely, yes.
There's one going back to the question around the infrastructure. Oh, wait, sorry. Back to the question of the treatment center. Could the construction of the pit house not be considered reawakening cultural practices, also using Indigenous people for various roles in that?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I definitely agree. It is. It's just the funding guidelines, and we're constrained by, we just don't fund infrastructure through this grant. But like Lucas said, we do have a grant that does fund heritage infrastructure. So that might be something that that your organization could put together, an infrastructure grant. Look at that for infrastructure funding in the future, and then cultural practices around infrastructure or around the center through this grant if you want to do an application.
Okay, the next one, I'll get it. Like, would an application be considered from an individual living away from their First Nations community who is eager to begin their cultural journey through the documentation and making of regalia for their community?
Unfortunately, we can't fund individuals through this grant. We can just fund BC First Nations and First Nation-led organizations. But if you have a connection with an organization or with your community, then that might be something that you could talk to them about, putting an application together that would come from that community or that organization.
Would you please go over the information from the slide on who can apply related to what applicants may be required to share again? Legal name, certificates, etc.
Yes, absolutely. Let me just pull up my notes so that I make sure I can get that right.
And
Mhm.
would information this be asked, requested as part of the application after it is submitted or after it is awarded?
Mostly we would ask for things like a list of a current board of directors, certificates of registration, copy of bylaws and constitution, proof of insurance. Those are things that we would request after we've determined that a grant will be awarded. The application itself asks for the legal name of the organization and the address and a contact person. And I know for some organizations who have already applied for grants through FPCC, that information is already on file with us. So those requests would come for organizations that haven't received grants from FPCC before. And all of that information is also in the funding guide. I'm trying to answer questions, but I'm also looking for the funding guide and trying to drop that link into the chat. Actually, at the top of the chat. If you can scroll, if you want to scroll up to the top of the chat, there are links there, and it's all posted on our website as well.
I can drop the link in there too in a sec, just again to refresh it.
Thanks, Kim.
One more question was just confirming that regalia making is, regalia making activity for the community would be eligible?
Yes, yes, if it definitely, if that's a culture, if that's a project that came from the community or through an application from an organization, yes. We just can't fund through this grant. We can't fund individuals. We can't fund families or clans. It has to be, we're quite limited to recognize BC First Nations and First Nation-led organizations. Regalia making will be a great project.
So the next question is there a section in the grant highlighting the in-kind support from other organizations? For example, the municipal government, shared use of buses, gymnasiums, or human resources. Do you think this will give merit to the application?
Oh, that's a two-parter. Yes, there is a section in the application in the budget. The application has 5 or 6 different sort of tabs or worksheets that you're guided to work through, and the budget worksheet has asked for information about how much funding you're requesting through FPCC, and then it also asks how much funding you have from other sources, whether that's grants or monetary contributions, and it also asks for in-kind the in-kind amount, if any. So that is in there, and it's pretty, I think it looks pretty clear and straightforward to go through. In terms of if projects are seen as having more merit if they have additional funding, yeah, that can be the case sometimes. It helps to show that that your project is well thought out, that it's been considered and funded by other organizations, so you have support, and it gives a bit more. It can not always. I mean, it's definitely not necessary, but it can show that that other organizations, governments have confidence in your community organization's ability to successfully carry out a project. But it is not necessary to have outside support.
And I don't know if you said this correction, but the funding would have to be confirmed. So
yes,
I
didn't just say that this time. Yeah,
a confirmation letter from another funder would be required if you're adding those other funds to the budget.
Mm-hmm.
If a project would serve multiple nations, would a single nation need to serve as the lead applicant?
Yes. I can see a couple ways that might work in an application. One would be if the application was from tribal council. That would be one way. Another might be if it is from an organization, like a nonprofit organization that serves multiple communities. But we also really encourage collaboration. So a single organization could apply on behalf of a group of organizations, and then you would want to include letters of support from all of them, verifying that they are aware of this and that they're supportive of the project that you're proposing. But yes, definitely.
And I wanted to add, on the current grant portal, there's an option or a feature to add collaborators. So you can add another project lead from another nation, or just from other people that you want to help with your project. But one organization or community would take on the responsibility of like the reporting and the finances. But otherwise you can collaborate with, I don't know if there's a limit, but one or a few more organizations you can collaborate with.
The next question is, the funding guide says applicants may be asked to provide a proof of support from a BC First Nations in the form of Band Council resolution or a letter of support. Would this be required in the application package or afterward?
Letters of support are required as part of the application. So depending on if you're applying as a band, as a First Nation band, or if you're applying as an organization, there are slightly different requirements for who the letters of support should be from. And there's a place within the application for you to upload those letters of support. And it's two letters of support for a band applying, and 3 letters of support for an organization supplying.
Oh, sorry, I'm just going to go over to the Q&A again. Let me see here. As a tribal council, we normally get a letter of support from our board of directors, the chair. Our board of directors are chiefs or councillors from our member nations, and then another letter of support from our elder council. Would those be accepted?
Yes. Yep, absolutely. I just pulled up on page 9 of the funding guide. I know you can't read this now. I've got the blur on, but there are on page 9 of the funding guide. So if you're applying as a BC First Nation band or a tribal council, you would need a governance approval letter. So just like you said, it would either be a BCR or a dated signed letter from chief counselor or band manager, and then a letter of support, a community support letter. So in that case, an elders council would be eligible to do that. So yes. And if you're, just for a little extra info, if you're applying as a society or nonprofit organization, you also need a governance approval letter. So that would be a signed, dated letter from the executive director or the general manager there. And then you need 2 letters of support, community support. So one could be from a project participant, someone with high standing in the community, or from a collaborating community or organization. And then the second letter of community support is from a First Nation that is in the territory where the project is proposed. And so that could be a BCR, it could be a letter from the chief or council, or a letter from a BC First. So this is a little trickier, and it might not apply to everyone. Or it could be a letter from a BC First Nation organization, so another organization in the same location where your project is proposed, who is currently an FPCC grant recipient. So that, I think, is probably a narrower sliver of folks for whom that would be the case. But if you are working with an organization and you have a partner organization that you know has a current FPCC grant for some of their work, they would be able to write you a letter of support.
So the next question is, would this grant be able to be used to have a group to find the cultural background, including traditional names that were passed down through generations, as well as stories and songs that belong to their families?
Yeah, there is documenting cultural practices and cultural knowledge is an eligible activity under this. I would just say if that was a project you were doing, to be very clear in the contemporary, how that information can be used today in the community to revitalize cultural heritage practice, and to make sure that there is a training or mentorship component and an intergenerational knowledge sharing. So for instance, just a research project with one researcher going to document this might not be rated as highly as one that has those other elements of awakening and revitalizing that information in the community today.
So another question relating to infrastructure. So how do you categorize sweats and sweat lodges? For example, what about blankets or poles or rocks for these sweats?
That is a good question. I might turn to Lucas for that, since Lucas leads the Heritage Infrastructure Project. Would you consider the materials used to build and hold sweats to be infrastructure?
I think if they are connected with the construction itself, I think we can consider it, because for the heritage infrastructure program, we can include some materials that are required for the infrastructure functioning.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the actual I think that this grant could fund the practices around sweats and the materials involved, but maybe not necessarily the building of the sweat lodge. That's not to say that the community had other funding to build that lodge, that this grant could then fund activities around that. We have about 5 minutes left, so we're trying to get to as many questions as possible, but if we don't get to yours, or if you just want some clarification, please do reach out after we finish today. I think we probably have time for a couple more.
The next question is about how to contact you, if it's possible to contact directly to you to discuss some specific questions. The question is about accessibility, but I think the question is good for general specific inquiries.
Gretchen, do you want to share your contact slide again?
Yes, you bet. And I just dropped my my email into the chat as well. But yes, let me go back to the contact slide. All right. Hopefully everyone can see that. That has the website. And on the website is a link to, you'll find a link to the information about the grant that includes the eligibility guidelines, the funding guidelines, which is a document that will guide you through the application process and hopefully answer some of your questions. And then there's my email as well. We'll also, because this meeting is being recorded, the session is being recorded, we'll also make this available as well.
I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. We have more than that, but we'll, as Gretchen said, follow up if we don't get to your question. I've been trying to pay attention to the Q&A as well. There's one more question there. So if our society is already an FPCC grant recipient, do we still need to provide these documents, including a letter of support?
Okay, so you would need letters of support for your grant application. So if sorry, Kim, that was someone from an organization?
Yeah, it's saying it was a society.
Or society, okay.
Yeah.
So yes, you would still need the 3 letters of support. So one from the governance body of the society, so the executive director or the general manager, and then the 2 letters of community support. But if you already have an FPCC grant, then it's likely that we won't need to reach out and ask for things like your society registration information or your banking information for transfer of funding and things like that, because those should already be in our system. I think we have time for one more before we have to wrap up.
Okay. Would the materials needed to do hide tanning, drum making, etc., be included in funding?
Yes.
And on that same note, you can fund the practice of going out to teach the young where and how to gather these items, I think this might be a statement rather than, maybe it's a question. It can fund the practice of going out to teach the young where and how to gather these items, making rush mats or traditional ways. So just along the same note as the above. Those sound like eligible
absolutely.
activities.
Eligible activities for sure. Yeah.
There is another question. I think it's a good one for closing process. maybe you already told us about this, but it's about sharing this mirroring information after the meeting.
Oh, sharing information from this session?
Yes.
Yeah, yes. So we will share the recording once it's ready. It will be a link to it will be posted on FPCC's website. I believe that everyone who registered for this webinar had to include your email. And so I will find a way to do a group email that just has a link to that as well. And I'll put a link to the funding guide and our eligibility guidelines and anything else that is in just the FPCC website. So I will send out an email with that information as well. So that probably is a very good place to stop. I'm so thankful that everyone came and spent an hour of their time learning about this grant and asked such good questions. I'm really very excited to see what kind of projects are proposed. There's such important work that you're all doing. And thanks to Lucas and Kim for being great support and leading the question charge.
Thanks, Gretchen. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.
Thank you,
Have a great
everyone.
afternoon.